This move, advancing the king's pawn 2 squares, immediately fights for central space and opens diagonals for both the queen and bishop, setting the stage for a wide variety of classical opening systems. This move initiates the Sicilian defense, a complex and asymmetrical opening that immediately challenges white's central pawn and aims for active piece play and counterplay on the queenside. This move prepares to control the center and potentially launch an attack, while also developing a piece towards the kingside and setting the stage for mainline Sicilian defenses. This move solidifies the central pawn structure and prepares to develop the dark-squared bishop, establishing the foundation for a Sicilian defense variation. This move initiates the main line of the open Sicilian, immediately challenging black's central pawn control and creating a dynamic imbalance for piece play. This captures the pawn, opening the d-file and allowing white to regain the pawn with their knight, leading into common Sicilian lines. This recapture develops a piece and prepares for potential kingside castling, while maintaining central tension in this Sicilian defense. This move develops a piece, challenges white's central pawn, and prepares to castle, directly contesting white's advantage in central space. This move maintains white's central pawn presence and develops another piece, reinforcing the knight on d4 and preparing for potential pawn advances or further development. This move, known as the Najdorf variation, is a flexible choice that prepares to control the d5 square and potentially develop the queen's bishop to a more active diagonal later on. This move develops the bishop to a standard square, preparing to castle and controlling important central squares on the e2-4 diagonal. This move transitions into a Velimirovic attack type structure within the accelerated dragon variation of the Sicilian defense, aiming to gain central space and prepare a kingside pawn storm. This move prepares to retreat the knight to a safer square, anticipating black's likely e5 advance and maintaining flexibility in white's pawn structure. This move develops the bishop to a natural square, preparing to castle kingside while also preventing white's knight from jumping to b5 and contesting the c5 square. This move achieves kingside safety and prepares to connect the rooks, a standard developmental step in this Sicilian Najdorf variation aiming to control the center and launch an attack. This move strategically castles the king to safety behind a protective pawn shield, a fundamental principle of opening play, while preparing to connect the rooks for future action. This move prepares to develop the bishop to a more active square, potentially targeting black's queenside or supporting a future kingside attack while maintaining central control. This move develops the bishop to a natural square, reinforcing the central pawn on d6 and preparing to contest the e4 pawn and potentially target the knight on b3. This aggressive pawn push on f4 immediately challenges black's central pawn on e5 and seeks to open lines for white's pieces, aiming for a kingside attack. This capture opens a diagonal for white's queen and centralizes black's knight on f6, creating a dynamic pawn structure. This capture opens the f-file for white's rook, creating immediate pressure along that crucial vertical and targeting black's kingside. Developing the knight to c6 adds another attacker to the center and prepares to contest white's control of the d4 square, potentially challenging the advanced d4 pawn. This move challenges black's central pawn structure, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and potentially create tactical opportunities on the d5 square. This move decisively resolves the tension in the center and opens the d-file for potential black rook activity, while simultaneously relieving pressure on the knight and preparing to challenge white's central control. This recapture on d5 opens the e-file for white's rook and creates a pawn majority on the queenside, which white can aim to advance later. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, challenging white's control of the d5 pawn and potentially preparing for a kingside initiative. This move is an attempt to gain space and pressure on the queenside, potentially targeting the b7 pawn and creating imbalances for later play. This move prepares to connect the rooks and defends the c7 square, anticipating potential threats along the c-file. This move aims to prevent black from developing their queenside pawns with b5 and b-7, thus restricting black's counterplay on the queenside. This knight's retreat to d7 repositions it to support the e5 pawn and potentially the c5 square, preparing for future pawn pushes or piece maneuvering in the Sicilian Najdorf. This move solidifies the queenside pawn majority and prevents black's knight from finding a more active outpost on b4. This move repositions the rook to the open e-file, aiming to control it and potentially create pressure along the diagonal that runs through white's king. This move reinforces the d5 pawn and prepares to challenge black's central control, potentially opening lines for white's rooks or bishops. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, supporting the knight on e5 and preparing for potential kingside action or defense. bf2 aims to reroute the bishop to a more active square, potentially g3, to target black's kingside and exert pressure on the d5 pawn. This move boldly challenges white's bishop on e3, forcing a decision and aiming to disrupt white's harmonious piece development. The knight repositions to d2, clearing the c3 square for a pawn advance and preparing to potentially redeploy to a more active square like f3 or e4, while also defending the e4 pawn. The knight repositions to f6, reinforcing the center and preparing for potential kingside activity, while also offering a trade of knights to simplify the position if white accepts. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, potentially preparing to attack the f6 knight or support a central pawn push, while also clearing the f3 square for another piece. This capture on e4 is a strategic concession of central space and control, exchanging the active knight for a potentially passive bishop but aiming to simplify the position and potentially disrupt white's attacking plans. This recapture opens the e-file for white's rook, aiming to contest key central squares and potentially pressure black's queenside. This move challenges white's knight and aims to exploit the weakness on the g2 square, seeking to open lines for black's pieces and create active counterplay. This move reroutes the rook to a more active square, aiming to pressure black's queenside and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside. This move aims to reposition the rook to a more active file, potentially supporting a kingside advance or preparing to contest the a-file. This move prepares to defend against potential threats on the g-file and allows the bishop to potentially reposition, while also preventing the black knight from occupying the g4 square. This move repositions the rook to the highly active e-file, preparing to challenge white's control and potentially support a pawn advance while also defending the e7 pawn. The bishop's retreat to f1 prepares to redeploy to g2, aiming to pressure the a6 f1 diagonal and support potential pawn advances in the center or queenside. This move aims to create a defensive pawn chain on the kingside, preparing to challenge white's control of the d5 pawn and potentially gain space with a subsequent f5 push. This move activates the queen, aiming to pressure black's queenside pawn structure while simultaneously preparing potential sacrifices on the kingside or creating entry points for the queen along the a5-d8 diagonal. The move 25, qc8 is a reactive maneuver, relocating the queen to defend the vulnerable c6 pawn and prepare for potential counterplay along the c-file, while also anticipating white's pressure on the queenside. This move aims to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses on the b-file while opening lines for the rook. This move, nf7, prepares to reroute the knight towards the kingside, potentially supporting a future kingside attack or defending key squares. This move initiates a strategic repositioning of the rook to the queenside, aiming to support potential pawn advances on the a-file or to prepare for a transfer to the kingside, depending on black's response. This move aims to centralize the queen, prepare for potential advances on the kingside, and possibly contest the open d-file, while also keeping an eye on white's aggressive rook on a4. Rab4 repositions the rook to a more active square, potentially preparing to double rooks on the b-file or support pawn advances, while also defending the b2 pawn. This knight maneuver signals a repositioning to defend the kingside and potentially attack the weakened b6 pawn, while also preparing to bring the knight to a more active central square later in the game. This move 29, Ka4 is a proactive repositioning to contest the queenside, aiming to disrupt black's potential pawn breaks and create threats on the c6 and b7 squares. The bishop exchanges itself here, aiming to simplify the position and reduce white's attacking potential, particularly after the recent pawn advances on the kingside. This move simplifies the position by exchanging queens, which aims to reduce the attacking potential on white's kingside and transition into a potentially more manageable endgame where white has a slight space advantage. This rook sacrifice on d7 aims to exchange pieces and simplify into a favorable endgame, exploiting white's doubled pawns and creating a potential passed pawn on the d-file. This rook move initiates a plan to control the central d4 square and potentially exchange on d5, aiming to simplify the position and activate the rook on an open file after the exchange. The recapture on d7 has simplified the position, and black's bishop now returns to g5, repositioning to eye the weakened f2 pawn and potentially prepare for a rook lift to the kingside. White repositions the rook to d1, preparing to contest the open d-file and potentially centralize the piece to support future pawn advances or defensive maneuvers. This move repositioning the knight to f7 aims to contest the d5 pawn and prepare for potential advances like na5, while also freeing the g8 square for the king should it become necessary. This move repositions the rook from a potentially vulnerable advanced square to a more solid and flexible central position, supporting the d5 pawn and preparing to contest the third rank. The bishop retreats to f6 to protect the weakened pawn on g6 and to potentially participate in controlling the central squares, while also preparing for potential future pawn advances on the kingside. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, potentially supporting a queenside expansion and adding pressure along the d-file. This move simplifies the position by exchanging bishops, which can be advantageous for black as it reduces white's attacking potential on the kingside and opens lines for black's pieces. This move continues white's strategy of consolidating their rook advantage in the endgame, aiming to pressure black's isolated d-pawn and restrict black's pieces. This move initiates a tactical sequence aiming to exploit the doubled pawns on the kingside and potentially create counterplay on the open d-file. The rook repositions to b4, preparing to contest the open b-file and potentially support a kingside pawn advance or defend against black's centralizing efforts. This move repositions the knight from d8 to d8, aiming to potentially bring it to the kingside via e6 or f7, or to support a kingside pawn advance later in the game. The rook on a3 aims to centralize and support the other rook's activity on the third rank, preparing to contest the open d-file and potentially assist in a queenside advance. This move repositions the rook to defend the d7 pawn, which is currently vulnerable after white's queen maneuver, aiming to consolidate the position and potentially prepare for further activity on the d-file or queenside. This move reinforces the queenside pawn structure and prepares to bring the rook back into play on a more active file, potentially targeting black's central pawn. This move activates the rook to an open file, threatening to infiltrate white's position and potentially target weak pawns or create attacking opportunities. This move re-centers the rook, preparing to contest the crucial open c-file and potentially support a future advance of the d-pawn, aiming to improve white's piece activity and pawn structure. The knight retreats to f7 to improve its defensive coverage of the kingside and prepare for potential support of the d-pawn or a regrouping maneuver to a more active square like e5 or g5, while avoiding white's queenside pressure. This move repositions the rook to the kingside, preparing to support a potential advance of the f-pawn and create tactical threats against black's king, while also potentially contesting the semi-open f-file. The knight repositions to g5, targeting the weak h3 pawn and preparing to contest the g-file, potentially creating dynamic counterplay for black. This move is a useful prophylactic maneuver, shifting the king away from the potentially dangerous central files and towards the kingside corner, providing a safer haven from any direct threats that might arise from black's active pieces. This move finally unifies the rooks on the 7th rank, setting up pressure against white's kingside and preparing to exploit the weak f-pawn if it becomes undefended. This move aims to reposition the bishop to a more active square, potentially targeting the black king's defenses or supporting an advance of the rook pawns. This move reinforces the knight on d8, preparing to contest the open c-file and potentially redeploy the knight to a more active square. This move aims to create a defensive pawn chain, protecting the king and potentially preparing to advance the h-pawn to gain space and activate the kingside. This check aims to disrupt white's king safety and force a rook exchange, which could simplify the position favorably for black by activating the rook on the h-file.